Hello, welcome. This is a free thought program sponsored by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. And I'm wanting to welcome you. I'm Joe Barnhart.
Hello, and I am Bill Calhoun. We want you to know that even if you do or don't believe in God, that you're not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, you'll find free-thinking people who are atheists and agnostics. This is a show for them and for people committed to a life rooted in science and free of supernatural beliefs.
Good. We want to invite everybody to be with us. Our topic today is when or how did ethics or morality begin, both in a group setting and an individual setting. But we'll explore this at some length.
But first, we'd like to tell you a little bit about the sponsors of our show. The Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun night up at the bar or eatery. Tonight's meet is up at Bartley's in the Old City, starting around 5:30. On entering Bartley's, look for the silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. And as Mott Delahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Okay, the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. First and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures with a lively roundtable discussion, very lively discussion. I think you would enjoy them. The second Sunday, we hold the Skeptics Book Club discussion. On the fourth Sunday, alternating with a get-together and reflection. And then if you have a potluck time, if you're enjoying that, to have that sometimes. On alternate fourth Sundays, we will meet to play board games and similar activities for fun.
Later in the show, we'll give you our websites and places to visit for additional details, including times and locations.
Okay, and we don't have too much in the news we want to get at, so let's get right to the topic. When did morality begin and how? How would you think it would start historically? This is Bill Calhoun from the University of Tennessee. He's a retired professor and chair of the Department of Psychology.
Okay. It seems so obvious to me that if we go back in our minds and think about how people first began to develop, they developed into small groups or bands we would call tribes. And within the tribe, typically you'll find the female or the woman had a real major control in the tribal area, often because the men were off hunting or in some cases off at war. But it begins largely by example. You could, it's the old saying, it's not do as I say, not as I do. It's more like do as I do, not as I say. And there's a little story where a man walks into a putt-putt golf shop with two of his kids. One is a boy that's about 9 and one's a boy about 4. And the prices for 5 and under are 0, and for 10 to 6, $1, and for an adult, $1.50. So the father says, "I'll have one adult and one child." And so he lays out his $2.50, and the man says, "Oh, you should have told me the other kid was under 5. I wouldn't know any difference." And the man stopped right there and said, "But my sons would." That, to me, is a very powerful statement about how children learn about morality. I want my kids to be like I am. "Hey, Dad, why are you complaining about how I drive? You've got a radar detector in your car, haven't you? And aren't they illegal?" Same kind of thing. Mommy will say, "Now, John, don't hit your sister. She might hit you back." So in a certain sense, also, morality is based upon rules between the siblings. How can we get along and feel good? And that's about what it is, about getting rules set up in the home, in the family, in the tribe, making life better for everyone.
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned on this program, the first time I heard the golden rule that I can remember is my mother said to me, when I did something to hurt another person, another child, pushed or something, she said, how would you feel if someone did that to you? And there I was learning very early what empathy is, to get inside another person's frame of reference.
That's an important term, empathy. I recall when I was first taking a course in anthropology, the teacher talked about sympathy and empathy, and I just sat there and said, I don't know what you mean. But I finally learned slowly and steadily, if you can take the position of the other person, that's empathy. You're hitting your brother. It hurts him, doesn't it? How does it make you feel to hurt your brother? One of the things they find with people who have been involved in sexual abuse of, for example, a young man abusing a young woman, you try to end the group therapy situation. You try to say, hey, Joe, how do you think Susan felt when you did that? And then Mike will say, I bet you Susan felt really bad, and I can understand. That's what empathy's about, and we learn through that.
Yeah, I can remember as an older child watching my mother, in particular, and my aunts, teaching this by example, just putting themselves in the child's place and feeling with the child. Now, it takes some intelligence to do that, to get inside another person's frame of reference. I don't know how much an animal can do this. I think maybe the maternal instinct in animals has something to do with this. But human beings have to intellectually project into another person, wouldn't you think? And that takes some intelligence to do that. Otherwise, we project ourselves into another person rather than to get inside to look at it from their point of view.
Well, some of the animal examples are interesting. For example, wolves that hunt in packs have to have a means of communication. They have to have a sense of what the other person is about. I think that animals often have what we would call empathy. Some of my friends would disagree with me, but on the other hand, it's really interesting to watch how animals interact and play. The thing about, I think, psychology, we have to always constantly remind ourselves is what we're about is how people interact, how we interact with the world. For example, I pick up the cup or the pen, how I interact with my friend Joe. It's not about me acting alone. And that's where group therapy or group sessions are so powerful, because you can get people to interrelate to each other and begin to take the position of the other person. That way, you teach empathy.
It's very hard to think of a person as being strictly a solipsist, as simply himself or herself alone, and that's it. Even in traditional theology, they had to think of God with angels and archangels, and then the Christian tradition, they had to have a Trinity, because that's interaction, that's a social dimension of a deity. In other words, the notion of a pure, isolated individual all alone, in some ways just doesn't develop into a person. For one thing, you wouldn't have language. So individuality is always, would you say individuality is a social gift?
Yeah, I think in one of the books, I think it's Thoreau, says to go into solitude. You can't go into solitude unless you have been with other people. And then you use solitude as a time to reflect, to think. Thomas Merton, for example, spent many years alone, but still, he had to have that reference group that he came from and went to. Yes, we can be alone at certain times, but we are a pack animal, if you want to use that expression. We live in groups. We live in herds. We move together as a group. If you've ever watched a flock of starlings, and this time of year it's a great one to watch those birds fly, and you ever ask yourself which bird's in the lead? None or all. They really act as a unit.
It's a rhythm almost, isn't it?
It's awe-inspiring. If you want to think about something spiritual, watch a flock of starlings as and they're playing, they're cavorting. They're not going someplace to eat or sleep. They're just playing around. Now, of course, they know that when it gets dark, they will find a place to roost and sleep.
So we're suggesting then that ethics has deep, deep roots, animal roots, and then moving into the human species, and we inherit the groupness from our animal roots, and then we develop it. And that's what we mean by growing and developing character. We have to develop character. Now, would you say animals have, some animals at least have shame? Do they have guilt? That's a big problem, I know. A dog, I know, has
Well, when
shame.
you raise a pet in a home like a dog, they behave so differently than they behave if they were outside alone and alive, or feral, that is. But yeah, you hit a dog sometimes, and they'll come over and they'll look at you so sad. So in a sense, that's what we would think. Our empathy would tell us that the dog feels guilty. Whether they feel guilty, we'll never know. You never know feelings. You only know what people do.
Well, you can shame a dog.
Surely.
And you could say shame becomes guilt when you don't have anybody else around and you feel ashamed. In other words, you judge yourself and you feel ashamed, and in that sense it's guilt. You got your own standards now.
Yeah. Well, years ago, an anthropology professor had me try to analyze Japanese culture, and he referred to them as a shame culture, whereas Europeans as a guilt culture, especially people who are involved in Christianity. And so they tend to serve the same function, but they tend to operate in different
ways.
You must save face in the Japanese notion. You can't be shamed. You can't let the neighbors see you. For example, I read somewhere the young executive in Tokyo can't be home before 5. The neighbors might think he's not working as hard, so we'll stop off at the little tea shop for 15 minutes to make sure he gets home late and looking like he's working extra hard. Yeah. But one thing people did as we developed is we developed writing. And that has good points and has bad points. But in the history of Western tradition, there's a famous code called the Code of Hammurabi, where these rules that had evolved from years and years of groups working together were first hammered into cuneiform on metal or stone. And now the rules are set down. And the issue I'd like to raise is, are the rules powerful just as words on a stone, or are they still what you do that's important? And I would argue that it's what you do, it's not what you have memorized. And a lot of Western culture kind of gets caught up in the memorization, or what I would call the cognitive component of morality, and then forgetting about the emotional component, which is really where it lies.
Yeah, we have a good caller. Let's hear what we have to say. Go ahead, caller. Oh, I'm sorry. Give us a name and where you're from, would you?
Caller is just fine. I'm living over in Blount County.
In Blount County. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, earlier I heard Bill say something about when you hit a dog.
Yeah.
And that upset me. I really don't think you should be hitting dogs.
I agree.
So that actually offended my sense of morality.
Good.
And so I had to call and at least say, stop it. You know, it's not a nice thing to do. But anyway, regarding your show's topic, when did morality start, or all of that, it's caused a question in my mind. And that is, well, as you were talking about, morality develops from reason, and you mentioned survival in the animal kingdom, or rationale, or empathy. That's something that people go through to develop their moral sense. Is that what you're trying to say? Am I correct?
I think you're right.
Yes, that sounds right. And by the way, I don't hit my dog.
Well, don't start. It's very, very bad.
I understand that. I understand that. I used it as an example.
Okay.
Okay, but
Well, I'm glad, the viewers are put straight on that. Wouldn't want people going out and following some sort of bad example.
in fact,
Anyway,
you open up the door to the points. One of the points we wanted to make, but don't leave on pain as one of the sources of developing morality. Well, go ahead. You had a point you were going to make.
Yeah, well, if you're saying that these are the bases or the foundation for morality, and I agree with you, empathy and all of that, then I was sitting there going, well, I can only come to one conclusion about people that get their morality from a book or a decalogue of commandments or such. And that is only that these people must be immoral. Therefore, and the reason being is because these people, if that is where they're basing their morality, and I've heard theists say, well, if you're not a Christian, where can you possibly be getting your morality from or your morals from?
Okay.
And the answer to that is Christians are immoral. And I think I have a point to support that.
Let me point that. I make a distinction between a particular point of view and the people who might hold to it. I think the Christians I know, most of them are really good people. And some parts of theology are pretty good, it seems to me, and some parts are pretty wicked. So you have to make distinctions on this. I think I know.
Well, I agree with you, Joe, and you're trying to be very diplomatic and tactful about it. And you're saying that they're good people, but what I'm saying, and by what y'all were saying before, is that they are immoral. If this is where you're basing your rules about morality, if your morality comes from a set of rules from a book, and think about this. What do moral people feel when they hurt someone else? They feel shame. They feel they feel guilt. They may not be able to sleep well at night because they realize how the other person feels, just as you said before. However, if you are an immoral person, meaning that you're just following a set of rules, then you would be able to do great harm to any group of people, any child, any woman, and not feel any guilt.
Well, I would agree. What I'm trying to say, and I think you'll probably agree, is that Christians on the whole are much better than their theology. As persons, much better than the theology.
Then what you're saying is they're operating at a disadvantage, and therefore they've gotten by their faulty morality.
Well, let me. I don't want to dichotomize this too quickly. Much of what's in the Bible, like kindness, or 1 Corinthians 13, which we have time we might read, it seems to me to be a good moral example.
Well, that may be, but isn't Corinthians past Jesus and past the Old Testament?
Well, it's part of the Bible.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I think what you're trying to say, don't let me put words in your mouth now.
Well, I think I said it pretty clearly.
Okay.
If you're getting your morality from a set of rules that you do not have to work through to reason, to empathize, then what you have is an immoral system. What you have is simply a set of rules.
Okay.
Do as I say, not as I do. Just as you said before, the matriarch of a tribe leads by example.
I make a good, clear distinction between most Christians and the preachers. Are you with me?
Okay.
Most Christians I know what ordinary sympathy and compassion and empathy that we're talking about. They know what it is, and they know they didn't get it from a book. Are you with me? They already know this.
Sure. I'm sure the ones that you know maybe are civilized.
Now, I don't like to get in the position to think because people are Christians, they're not civilized. I think that's not accurate.
No. I was saying the people you know are civilized.
Yeah. Okay, now.
Didn't say they were moral. I just.
Now, are you
Civil
saying
rights.
this? If someone is saying to you and to me that their morality is solely on a book, then that's at least contradicting what they actually are living.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would go along with that. I
Well,
think that's accurate.
Does the Bill? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your last name, or I don't remember it. Rather, do you have something?
Bill Calhoun. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. You were making a point.
Him? Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the only point I had was just what I said. If you're saying that morality comes from empathy, reasoning, working through it, feeling it, experiencing it, perhaps practicing it, then if you were operating on a set of rules, for example, the Ten Commandments, don't steal and don't kill. Now, the way I figured, if somebody has to be told that, then it's probably a good thing we have the Ten Commandments, because otherwise we'd have all these people running around stealing people's stuff and killing.
Okay, you're a parent, right?
Okay, no, I'm not.
Okay.
I have a dog.
Okay. Well, there's a difference.
I hope so.
Okay. You tell your children early, don't steal, don't lie, and it takes a long time to train them not to verbally. You also try to show, as Bill was trying to point out very clearly, I thought, to set example about not lying and not stealing and certainly not killing. You do both. All the rules are simply statements of the patterns that work. And what we're trying to do with our program here is to show how morality begins. And so let us focus on the topic specifically. It has to start, first of all, among human beings with desires. If there were not talking about human morality, if human beings had no desires, morality would be irrelevant. There would be no pain and there would be no pleasure. There would be no satisfaction without desires. Are you with me?
Yes, I didn't realize I had jumped the topic.
That's all right. That's good.
How did it begin? Well, it began with the Neanderthals and whoever else. As a matter of fact, it is present in animals as well.
It's pain, and you were very right to mention the pain in animals. And without pain, morality would be, and pleasure, morality would seem to be irrelevant. We don't worry about the pain, hitting a table. But
well, I was just that was the thought that y'all's discussion made jump into my head, and that is, if someone is not working through it and practicing it or experiencing it, then what you basically have is an immoral person. And I don't know how many, and will not experience the pain that a moral person has when they do such things as execute someone for having a different religion, or executing somebody for being homosexual, or executing someone for whatever reason that they find written in a book. And these, I think, are immoral people, and I'm not necessarily Christians. You can include any of the other people that go by that sort of.
Well, sure. And
Thank you very much for discussing it with me. I don't believe you convinced me that I'm wrong.
No.
I don't think you were trying to.
No. Thank you for calling for over in Maryville, or Blount County at least.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Now, that was good to bring up the question of pain, and because at root, that's what morality starts off as, is trying to reduce pain and suffering, and then try to develop pleasure. And if you develop pleasure that enhances deeper kinds of pleasure, then we move on toward happiness. And without pain or pleasure, then it seems to me this will all be irrelevant. And I know this sounds like a hedonistic. All the word hedonism means is just another word for pleasure. And so What I'm talking about, Bill, is long-term pleasure, because some of our pleasures are destructive of other pleasures.
Yes.
And so it's still the pain and pleasure factor working here. And so we develop guidelines to control ourselves as an individual. I control myself. And what I control are some of my desires, because I have other desires I want to satisfy. And I think this is the root of where morality.
Yeah, I think that part of what I picked up from the person calling in, I think, is that there are two ways to approach this issue about morals, and one is that they can be part of a person's upbringing and living, and they are essentially things that we have within us. But then there are those rules that are written down, and then sometimes are used by others to inflict punishment. And I think that makes sense. Yeah. Why do we have to write them down? And that's a really good question. The Celtic tradition is a very powerful, important tradition that preceded Christianity, but rarely gets much play because they didn't have a written history. And we do have a written history, and it's in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And there are other versions of that. Matter of fact, the Quran and the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible all have the same origin from Abraham, and they did have rules written down, and these rules they're idealistic, but I think also there's a tendency for people to be immoral occasionally because they're seeking a pleasure that normally mommy and daddy would say, that's not good. That's a no-no. And so we do kind of remind people, and also we write them down so we can have people, quote, memorize them and report them back, and which is part of our educational system. But you don't follow just what you say. You follow what you believe deeply inside. And empathy is something that I think has to be learned.
Yes, it does. And sociopaths apparently just don't learn it.
Sociopaths, yes. They're an interesting case study. There are sociopaths that seem to be born, but there are also sociopaths that seem to be made. And, I got a real experience once when I had a person who was working with me, and I was having difficulty getting along with this person. And I finally got some insight. I had been told that he had been very physically abused by his father. And part of what he was doing was looking at me as a father figure saying, Daddy, tell me exactly what I have to do so I won't get hurt. And I'm not used to dealing that way with people who are my subordinates. I want them to show some initiative. And not that I understood what this person was about only belatedly, but I can understand where that comes from. It's like, don't beat me, Daddy. Tell me what I must do not to be hurt. And those people have to have outside guidelines, and they need the rules. And there are
Bill, I have two examples. Both of them are ministers. They're good friends of mine. One of them, I think, is probably a sociopath, and the other, they hold to the same theology. They're both very conservative theologically. One of them, whose name is Bob, I won't give the other's name. Bob is a very compassionate, gentle person. He's what I'd call a minister. He ministers to people. He doesn't just preach, he ministers. He's a kind person. The other preacher, that was his specialty, preaching. And I think my observation, I was in school with him for years, I observed him, it seems to me he never developed anything like compassion or empathy for other people. We got another caller. Go ahead. Our caller.
Hey,
Go ahead.
This is Charles from Central Illinois.
Oh, Illinois. Good. Let's hear it.
Your topic today, your origins of morality.
Right,
And I like to point out that apparently a lot of the social species, like dolphins and meerkats and chimpanzees, both the bono and the pan, and the others have been shown this to demonstrate empathy for each other. I recall reading an account, for instance, of the meerkats refusing to abandon one of their injured, even though the extreme high temperatures and so forth would have made them very, very thirsty. And they waited and waited, and they only left finally after they knew it was dead.
Yeah, so you're saying that morality has deep animal roots.
Yes, and it's spread across many, many different species.
Very good, yeah. Let me ask you this.
Yes.
You know more about this now. Do rats have empathy?
Yes. They have, they are a somewhat social species, not to the extent of, say, meerkats or dolphins.
They're more limited in their group, are you saying?
Yes.
Okay. Would you say this? Don't let me put words in your mouth now. That morality, in many ways, is starting this small group, and then it develops to other groups.
Yes. There's a very famous case of in a zoo where a young child, human type, at the gorilla enclosure fell into the long, wide trench between the humans and the gorillas. And a female gorilla scrambled down and hugged and rubbed the child very gently, and then made certain that a couple of the big male gorillas stayed away from it. And
that's a good case of expanding morality, it seems to me.
Yes, and that didn't just expand within the species, but outside the species.
Outside the species. And would you say among human beings, part of morality is you have the clan, and then morality is moving beyond the clan to incorporate another clan?
Yes. It goes from the family group that might be like parents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so forth, and expand to the clan, which would be like uncles, wives, a brother, and
mothers and others,
her children, and so forth, to tribal, and so forth. Look at the universal horror that was exposed by the discovery of what the Nazis had done in their death camps. Okay? And how the German Wehrmacht was stunned when they discovered what the Japanese troops had done to POWs in World War II. And
even in wartime, we try to develop a morality for prisoners.
Yes.
Now, there are parts of in the ancient history, some of this you seem to pick up clues of this even in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that once you were captured, then you could be treated like a slave and maltreated and used like an animal.
Yeah, or...
and there's a passage in the Hebrew Bible that says, in effect, it's the Hebrews talking to each other. We were once foreigners, and the logic is that we knew what it was like to be a foreigner in a land Not our own.
Not our own. And thus we must treat them as we would have wanted to be treated.
Exactly. And there you have in the Hebrew Bible the golden rule.
Yes, but you don't have to look at just the Hebrews.
Other troops and groups. Exactly, right. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for bringing this up. From Illinois, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I've got some more points, and I know you got some more points we want to develop. But I want to thank you for calling in from Illinois, and I hope you'll be with us on other Tuesdays the same time. Thank you.
Well, it depends upon whether or not they change my work hours.
Oh, well, good luck on it. But
You too.
Thank you for our good luck. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, I'm glad he brought that up. A number of good points. We not only have desires of our own that we have to control for the sake of other desires, and of course there are other people with desires that we want to live with, so we have to restrain some of our own. And then we live in a world of nature.
Yes.
So that we can't satisfy all our desires by treating nature any way we want to.
Yeah, and I think that we have a dilemma at this time that we refer to in a variety of things that concern about the temperature changes and absence of water. And the Ebola thing created quite a crisis in the minds of all of us. And here we are dealing with something that was previously unknown. And we're finding people who are giving their own life to save others, and that's the height of empathy, I think.
Yeah.
They probably didn't understand at the time what they were doing. I recall when there was a pilot, or a Russian pilot, who was flying his helicopter over the atomic reactor that had burned up, and he was getting radiation doses, but he was dropping sand down to try to cool the thing down. He died from the radiation exposure only a year or so later. Yet here's a man who is... These are what you call examples from all of our life. There are extremes, but yes, in our day-to-day commerce, we have to have rules and regulations. Can you imagine living in New York City if all the streets were neither one way or two way, but just any way? That's kind of like, I guess, what happens if you go to Rome or something like that, where some of the Italian drivers apparently are really rigorous. But we have to have some rules, and I think most people will agree with that, though there are always people who are kind of pushing the barrier, which say, well, I want this for myself, so I'm going to sort of set aside the rules.
I remember talking, Bill, to a 12-year-old about having to restrain some of our desires, and I mentioned, I said, do you think we should have traffic regulations? And she said, well, sure. I said, would you think that maybe traffic regulations gives us more freedom for driving? And she said, what do you mean?
Yes.
12-year-old?
Yes.
And I said, well, if you didn't have some control of traffic, then you wouldn't be as free to drive on the freeway and on the streets. And she saw the point immediately that freedom and regulations go together.
Yes.
Depends on what the regulations are, of course, but that they are not opposed to freedom. They serve good regulations, serve the cause.
This
freedom.
Is always the balance between good regulations and not good regulations, and we're always kind of searching for that, as they call it, the golden mean, or in the Buddhist sense, it's the middle path.
The middle path.
We understand you can go to the far extreme, to the hedonistic side, or to the other side of being totally ahedonistic, to something in the middle where, because that's where most people want to live or will live, and will live most comfortably.
Now, all groups have to develop guidelines and regulations. If you're in a scientific community, it's very strict, because you cannot get up and just say anything that enters your head. You have certain regulations and guidelines you have to follow just to present a paper. And you have even time limitations at a professional meeting
Oh, yes.
to present the paper, and if you don't, somebody will stand up and tell you your time is up.
Yes.
And it should be that way.
Yes, yes.
And then you go there for the purpose of getting your paper criticized, not yourself criticized, your views criticized. Now we got another call. Let's see. Another caller. Go ahead, please. Give us your name and where you're from.
Hello, this is Joan.
Hello, Joan.
I live in Tennessee. A couple of things. One, a quick comment that we will have no book club in December.
No book club in
and
December.
That will be true from all Decembers forward, probably. But the other thing is, I'd like to ask a question about individual decisions about morality. In one of Pearl Buck's books about China, there's a story of a Chinese family that is starving practically. They can't stay on their land, and the mother is taking them. Her husband is taking them into a city because she knew that sooner or later people would riot and maybe they could go and steal from the rich. That's what happened during famines. Anyway, there are several children in the family, and when the woman who is pregnant gives birth to a baby, she kills the baby. And now my question is, here's this man and woman whose children are very, very hungry and they have another mouth to feed. Is she being moral or immoral in killing the baby who would die of starvation anyway? And I think often people, not often, but occasionally people run into questions where it's very hard to decide what's the most moral course.
Well, that's what the making of a tragedy is, wouldn't you think? When you have goodness, and yet goodness itself runs into other conflict with other forms of goodness. You want to keep both of them alive, all of them alive, but you can't. And so sacrifices have to be made. And of course, we recognize that in wars, that's happens all the time. But in this situation, I couldn't condemn the woman because the circumstances were so different from what we have. Would you agree on that?
Yes,
Bill?
I couldn't condemn her either. But you're talking to Bill.
Well, no, I wanted your opinion too. Go ahead.
No, I thought it was something the woman almost had to do, but it must. But I don't think it's easy to put a moral tag on it, and I'm sure there are other cases where it's very difficult to say this is moral or this is immoral.
Yeah, I got you. Sometimes the circumstances, sacrifices simply have to be made. Surgery is a good example when you have to maybe lose a limb. If it's infected so bad, you can't keep it.
Well, this dilemma of when is it moral and when it's not is spoken to by that famous story about the King Solomon, when the two women came to him, both claiming a child. And he, in his wisdom, said, well, let's cut the child in half. And of course, that's a story that may or may not have ever been true. But the point is that there are certain dilemmas like this that there is no answer. And we have to, that's where atheists and agnostics tend to get a lot of their spirit, is that we can accept things for which there are really no answers. And whether this woman's doing right or wrong, there's no way to say it other than to simply say that we should not judge her.
Mm-hmm.
She did what she felt was. She did what she felt was at the time morally right, and I think that we have to defend that.
Yeah, you can't, because we just, when you're in a circumstance like that, you don't have good choices in the first place.
Life is often filled with that. That's the dilemma of how could God let my child die when your child is healthy? And the answer is, I don't know. The tradition in the Hebrew faith is that the rabbi is not only a teacher, but he's also a person who interprets the law. Mm-hmm. So members of the synagogue or the temple or the tribe will go to the rabbi and say, we have a dilemma, and will you help us sort this out? And they go and they read the Torah and they meditate and they pray, and they can come back and offer a solution. But human beings are fallible, as we all know that, and we have to understand that there's always some issue where you just can't make a rational decision. It's going to be emotional, and it's
you have cases that apparently, and even in the Bible,
oh yes,
where the deity has a tragedies that can't solve everything.
Mm-hmm. But in modern life, do you? I can't think of another example. But in modern life, have we recently seen similar things where it's very hard to make a moral choice?
Well, some cases in fairly recently, maybe a parent would give up a child to some other family if they can't raise them themselves. That's another. That often happens in adoptions.
Yes.
And that can be a real tragedy. I know my grandmother, who had several kids of her own, but there was a child that just simply needed adopting. And despite the fact that she had 8 or 9 of her own, they adopted another and raised the child, and became one of my aunts.
Well, thank you for your time. I won't take up any more time.
Thank you again, Joan. We appreciate it.
Thanks for your answers.
Yeah, morality does, as Joan's point is well taken, morality tries to avoid tragedies, but sometimes these dilemmas do come about, and so we can't be so, we try to get around the dilemmas best we can, but sometimes we can't just engage in judgment. By the way, in some religions, you have the notion of the deity learning empathy. Joan, I know you grew up a Christian. Okay, you're familiar with the doctrine of the incarnation.
Yes.
God became man. Now, it seems to me part of this idea is for God to learn something about what it's like to be human, and this is empathy. And I like that passage in Philippians 2 where this being who is in the morphe, the form of God, whether it's an angel or whatever, it's not clear in Philippians, comes down in the form of a human being born of a woman and divests himself of his divine nature, whatever that is, and becomes a human being, even to the point of death. You can't get more human than that, more finite. And I think this is, if you read the Hebrew Bible sometimes, you see the deity becoming very human. And I think Christianity is an attempt to try to say, if you got a God who's just removed, then he doesn't know what morality is. If you just set up rules. Our first caller, I think, was trying to get at the point, if you just set up rules out of power alone, you don't have moral rules. You just have might makes right, and that's immoral. I think that's what he was trying to say, and I think he's got a point on that.
And in modern life, we have to make a lot of decisions, and we don't always turn to a rabbi or a minister for it because there are other ways to make them.
Yeah. Would you agree we always like to have, we have to come to terms with this ourselves, but we also like to have other people who might say, well, I think they'd made a good decision despite the difficulties.
Of course, we're social people. Well, I said I'm going to say goodbye now, and thank you. Bye.
Well, thanks again, Joan. Appreciate it. Now, something you had said a long time ago, Bill, was interesting to me is some Catholics have to have the priest to tell them they are forgiven.
Yes.
And there's a good side of that, and the other side is not so good. To think that a priest has the power to determine whether someone's forgiven or not, that's wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But if a person says, I think I've made a right decision, but I like to have some other human being supporting me, then we all can understand that. We like to have support. And also, I think you would agree, we also like to have a little bit of advice in case we make mistakes.
Well, I think the confession is intended to do both of those things. Sometimes it can be misused by, like you mentioned, a minister who you thought was sociopathic. Well, there are probably some Catholic priests who are, and they can use the confessional as a means of exercising their power. But most priests will be very reflective and will do what you're saying is they'll recommend that, okay, what you did wasn't very smart, wasn't so good. And to remind yourself this, you might say some Hail Marys. But think next time before you do something like this. And yes, we need advice. We need someone else. And what often happens in a situation like this is the priest will say, well, I'm speaking on the authority of the bishop or the pope or actually God. But how we can misuse our sense of morality to make others conform to our way of thinking can be abused.
Yeah, that's using morality.
And that's where you have to constantly monitor this. In the case of research that you mentioned earlier, I've lived through the era when human beings have been used in research projects without any real overall supervision of what you would call ethical principles. And we had some problems, and eventually they developed a whole set of guidelines, and the rules are tremendous and they're complicated. They come out of the Department of Human Services, and any university that has money from any government agency like the NASA or NIH or NSF must follow these guidelines. And when I was head, I had a person who was supervising this, and he was just taking these rules and beating the people over the head with them. And I had to take him aside and remind him that, look, these rules are for helping people do research well, not to totally prohibit research. So we're constantly in this battle between too many rules and not enough rules, or how are rules used. And we can't get around that. No matter what you do in a jury, for example,
you have to have guidelines.
You're occasionally going to convict an innocent person and occasionally let go a, quote, guilty person, because that's the way it's set up. You don't have any, there's no choice. If you're against capital punishment, then you should vote innocent all the time. If you're for capital punishment, you should vote guilty all the time. But in either case will you be free of error. And that's the dilemma that God has put before us, is that in these situations, the woman had to say, do I kill my child to save the other children, or do I keep my child knowing that I'm going to harm the other children? And there's no answer to that question.
So what we're suggesting, at least putting out as a good conjecture, is that morality did not start on a Mount Sinai. It started down on earth, where people are trying to get along with other people. And even if you're going to do business, you have to have a rule to control thievery. You have to control dishonesty. And you have to have, if you're going to have a monetary system, you have to have stability. All of this is morality. And so morality then is, in that sense, I've used the word before, common consensus on how to get along with each other to make life more bearable, more enjoyable, safe, and secure. And so if there is a deity, then, and the deity is decent, then he has to have respect for those kinds of rules and regulations that serve the purpose of human beings, and beings that have feelings of pain and pleasure. And this, of course, would include animals. Now, I want to emphasize this notion of a context, which is, as a psychologist, social psychology. Help me with this. Is it psychology doesn't develop except in a social context?
Well, the sociologists have been noted for studying groups of individuals as groups, and psychologists typically have been studying individuals, often in the therapeutic setting, like Sigmund Freud talked about people whom he met one-on-one. Social psychology is sort of a blend of the two, because there are times when how individuals function is very much a matter of how the group functions. And a jury, for example, can be very clearly influenced by a very strong-willed member. But on the other hand, we still have a sense that a jury of your peers is a more humane or moral way to try to deal with some of these difficult questions about guilt and innocence. And context is important. There's no question that rules of combat, for example, are moral issues, but they still don't say thou shalt not kill. They simply say be nice when you do it. But also, if you have prisoners, you're not supposed to beat them and kill them and strangle them, but you can use them. You can't put them to work.
Basically, respect starts with have regard for the other person's pain and pleasure. I mean, I think that's rock bottom, and that would apply to an animal.
Certainly.
And then, what will be pain mentally to one person may not be pain or pleasure mentally to another, and there's where we have to learn to be sensitive. You could say something to me that might be offensive, but another person, it might not be offensive at all. And so we learn then to be tactful and understanding, and then also learn not to be so sensitive, because maybe good criticism is good for us. And so we develop rules and guidelines. And in a jury, for example, you mentioned you have to have guidelines in order to communicate what the responsibility is. And no matter how you feel, there are certain responsibilities. And hopefully you have a feeling for your responsibility. So in that sense, we could have dual feelings or multiple feelings.
One little example I'd like to mention before we're almost out of time. I was watching a mourning dove who was sitting on the nest, and I don't know if this was the he or the she, but the mourning dove was on the nest. And all of a sudden, the other mourning dove, the partner, flies in and lands nearby, and then the one that's on the nest flies off, and the other one comes over and takes over. That's empathy. And how did they communicate that back and forth? I'm going to leave for you to think about, because this is a cute example of how a male and female can cooperate in a moral way to help
work together.
Eggs.
Well, we have a tough topic to deal with, and I hope our audience has empathy for us and in our way of trying to stumble through this, to open the way to say that ethics is more complicated than we once thought.